My presentation today was focused on different cases, different nations in which there are language minorities like we have here in the United States. I always think that we learn a lot from looking at other cases so that we can bring some of those lessons back home. So I first talked about two European cases, and then two more indigenous cases, one in Mexico, in Chiapas, and the other one in New Zealand. And what I looked at was how the language was being used, what the sociopolitical forces regarding the language were, and then how it was being used in schools. And then made the connection with what is happening here in the United States. So that's what today's presentation was about.
So basically the question that I want to ask and answer in this presentation is about when, how, and for what purposes is bilingualism used in schooling. Of course, it's a classical sociology of language question. And sort of the two findings, which I'm going to sort of give you before we begin, is that all language education policies are locally situated, so that you can't think of language education policy as being the same in El Paso as in New York City. You have to ground it in local realities, and our different sociolinguistic and sociopolitical realities give us a plurality of these practices and of these policies, and I think that is good. And the second thing is that, and this is related to my talk yesterday, the idea that all state schools use really very different mechanisms for control of various language and identity practices to advantage dominant groups. And the question about what is taking place in schools in the United States, I think, has to be related to this foundation, the fact that we have to really understand why it is that state schools exist. So I'm going to talk today about 4 cases before I bring it back to the US. When I bring it back to the US, we will do some review of some of the issues that we talked about yesterday. And it's a review for many of you who know all this work so well. But I'm going to talk about 2 European cases. The case of Gallo, that is France, on the left upper hand corner of that slide. And Gallo is a language that is spoken in Brittany. Brittany is the northwest province, all the way up there. You see Breton, and right next to it, Gallo. I'm going to talk a little bit about Gallo in more detail. And I'm going to talk about Luxembourgish, which of course is spoken in Luxembourg, and that's on the other corner there. And I'll tell you a little bit about both Luxembourgish and Luxembourg. And then I'm going to talk about a case that is very near to all of you. 2 indigenous cases, one very near, one very far. First, the case of Chiapas, and I'm glad that Alberto's here, because he tells me that his father is from Chiapas, and many of you have been there and have roots there, and the case of New Zealand, and then I'll bring it back to the US. So these are all places where I have done work, but I'm going to not speak of it from a case study perspective, but I'm going to use them as cases to draw some principles. And again, just a review from yesterday, just to make sure that we understand what it is that I'm working with. I'm working with a theory of language that believes that language is an action, that we're talking about language practices that are really the products of all social realities. So the idea that the way in which we language is a product of our social reality and not a static system of structures. And the idea, of course, that not all groups have the same languaging, especially in school options, right? Schools constrain language options. And then the third idea, related to the second one, of course, is the impact of power and the relationship of power languaging and schooling, that the language practices cannot be separated from power relations, political arrangements of nation states, and other social factors that impact on the options that people have to language, and especially the options that children have in schools to language, and the valuing of those practices. So I think that's sort of important. So I bring you back to the 4 cases, and I'm going to start with the first case, which is the case of Gallo, right? And again, Gallo, as I said before, is one of the languages of France, even though, as you know, France does not believe that they are really multilingual. And it is spoken in Upper Brittany, which is the northwest peninsula there of France. It's in dark yellow on the map. So something about Gallo as a language. Gallo is really a Romance language. It evolved from Vulgar Latin and Romance, which was spoken in this area, of course, for a very, very long time. It is one of the languages that, or one of the varieties of languaging that compose what people call the langue d'oil. It's related to Standard French, what we know as Standard French. It is spoken by 5% of the population of Brittany, so tiny minority, about 150,000 to 200,000 people, and it is used just in the local media, in radio and TV, in many cultural events, in music, etc. One of the issues with Gallo, and especially its use in schools among Gallo activists, of which there are many, is that there's really a lack of orthographic accepted standard. This is something that's very common and very known to all of you. Orlin, I know, has done a lot of work on this in Quechua and Bolivia. But there are 2 competing standards, right? There is what is called Écrit le Gallo, which is very distant from French, which is an attempt to make Gallo different from French. And it's a process that Heinz Claus, who was a famous sociolinguist, called a process of Ausbau. That is a process of taking languages that are similar or the same and making them very distant. So the idea behind this orthographic standard is that Gallo is different from French, so that they work on making these differences visible to children. And then there's the other one, the Modille de Gallo, which is more close to French, and it's favored by teachers because it is easier. So one of the things that you see right away is that there is a dichotomy or a tension between the ideological position of the language, the political position of the language, those that really wanted to be different from French and want to distance it as much as possible from French, and those that wanted very close to French because it's easier then for children to learn it, right? So that's about the sociolinguistics. Something about the sociopolitics of Gallo. One thing, of course, is that France refuses to recognize it. They refuse to recognize a whole bunch of things. But certainly, they have refused to recognize Gallo as a regional language, and they talk about it just as a dialect of French. And all of us know the very well-known definition of what a difference between a dialect and a language being, of course, that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And of course, since they don't have either an army or a navy, France says they are a dialect. It's a form of parler. It's a way of talking, they say. It's really not a language. So here you have this tension between the Gallo activists that really wanted to be a language, and therefore they are engaged in this corpus planning of really making the language separate from French in the orthographic reform, and then the nation state that does all the time trying to bring it together. That's a process of Einbau, right? So it's Ausbau and Einbau, right? So this is again Heinz Claus' idea. The nation state says it's the same. It's just that people are speaking differently because it's not a different language, right? The other issue I think that we have to contend with, and that the Gallo activists have to contend with, is that there's really opposition within Brittany itself. Brittany also speaks another language, Breton, which is a larger language, it's a more differentiated language. People understand it, and it's a Celtic language, so that there's this competition for Breton identity between those who speak Breton and those who speak Gallo. So this is important. So what happens in schools? Well, just lately, in the last decade, Gallo has been taught as an optional subject in school. It's taught as a traditional language subject. You know that Europe has moved away from traditional second language instruction. They are now doing what they call CLIL, right, which is content and language integrated learning, which is more of a bilingual education type of education. What I mean by that is, instead of offering the language as a foreign language, as a subject, which means that you're seeing it as an instrument that could be taught, you're using it as an instrument in teaching another subject. So instead of having traditional foreign language, what they are doing is they're teaching one subject a day, 2 subjects a day, maybe, in another language, and this is clearly. But with Gallo, they have kept on going with the foreign language subject, right? So it's a grammatical approach to the teaching of Gallo, not the use of Gallo to appropriate content. There are students who are learning it for the first time, but as you see, and I think this is the case in our case, in the US, most of those students are at the elementary level. And at least in New York City, what we see is that, right? Lots of bilingual education at the elementary level, and then as children get older, nothing. You see it there too. And the other thing that I think we have to consider is that it is taught separately as a heritage way of speaking and really not accepted otherwise. And again, I want to sort of focus on this word heritage that we use so loosely, because I do think sometimes the way in which we speak makes a difference. And I think the adoption of just talking about Spanish as a heritage language makes it seem as if Spanish is something of the past, instead of Spanish as a language of the future. And I think we want to question, again, the uses of these terms, and we can talk more about it. But that's the case of Gallo. So, just to sort of summarize the case of Gallo, what we have is very weak language in the community, that is, weak language practices, weak power, and a very weak language education policy where the language is taught only as an optional subject, mostly at the elementary level, always with a sense of being a heritage language, a language of the past, not a language of the future, taught very poorly and separately from French, never as a medium of instruction. And there is this non-development of a bilingual French-Gallo identity, which I think is important, because what it does then, when you separate it so much, is you can't have an identity as a French person and also have an identity as a Gallo person. And I think we have to look at that. We have to look at the consequences of the way in which we're taught and the kinds of identities that we construct for ourselves. And is it possible to be a French speaker and a Gallo speaker and be French and be Gallo at the same time? Is it possible for all of us to be Americans and Mexicans, Americans and Cubans, Americans and? So these are all things that I think we're going to discuss later. So the result of all this, of course, is that Gallo is disappearing. It's under tremendous stress. Language shift, a lot of activism around Gallo among people that want to preserve it, but there is no way out. I think we will see the shift towards French and the disappearance of Gallo maybe within my lifetime, possibly within most of your lifetime. So I take you now to an indigenous case, right? And this is the case of Tzotzil and Teltal, which, as you well know, are big languages in Chiapas, right? I want to remind all of you, because I'm sure you know about this much more than I do, that these are Mayan languages. They're mutually intelligible. They're spoken by a large percentage of the population of Chiapas, almost a fourth. 1/3 of those who speak Teltal and Tzotzil are monolingual in those languages. And I stress that because our tendency in scholarship is now to favor the postmodern, flexible, even my conceptualizations. And it's very important for me to remember that there are places in the world that are not involved in this globalization and this technology, etc. And I think my stay in Chiapas, working around indigenous schools around San Cristobal de las Casas, was very influential for me also. So I was able to see that there are realities that are still quite monolingual and quite tied to a local economy and local lives without really going out of the immediate community. And that's very important for us to work on as we work on bilingualism in the United States. It's also important to remember that these are languages spoken in the poorest state of Mexico. 90% of people in the indigenous regions have no running water. And there weren't any rural schools until the end of the 20th century. So we're talking about societies and communities, as many of you have experienced them, that are very different from the fluidity that we find in New York City or even across the border here. I also want to remind you then of the sociopolitics of Tzotzil, different situation from Galo. These were languages that were defended by the Zapatistas, that of course claimed their right to work, to land, to home, to food, to health and education of all the indigenous communities, and that were agreed upon by the Acuerdo de San Andrés on February 16, 1996, that actually agreed to linguistic and recognition of linguistic and cultural pluralism, some indigenous autonomy over the local governments, and an agrarian policy. And I also want to remind you that the government has really ignored these accords, and so that these indigenous communities have been left with this legacy of struggle, and then at the same time, not too much more. But there was some impact, of course, of this struggle, this political struggle, and there have been changes to the Mexican Constitution, as there have been changes to many of the constitutions in Latin America to recognize their indigenous languages, the rich diversity and plurality of languages in Latin America, which had not been recognized up to the 21st century. And there were changes to the Mexican Constitution, declaring, of course, Mexico as a pluricultural state. And then in 2003, the Ley General de Derechos Lingüísticos de los Pueblos Indígenas, in which 63 indigenous languages were actually declared to be national languages with the same values, and Article 11 of that same law that declared that bilingual education had to be exercised in the initial grades. And again, we can talk about all this. But the language education policy in the schools of Tzotzil and Teltal is that there has been, of course, this coordinación de educación intercultural bilingüe, and we can talk a lot more, I think, about this issue of what is intercultural, because it's a nice term that Latin America uses, and we wonder what it means to them, and what it means to us, and what would be the right way of thinking about it. But that is the term that they use. And the idea that this lengua originaria, which I think is a good term, right? The original language, the lengua originaria, would be used in transitional bilingual education. As a result, of course, Tzotzil and Tzeltal are being taught in the initial grades as a foundation for Spanish in, of course, transitional bilingual education, even though many people argue that it is really maintenance bilingual education. At least I can tell you that in the schools that I've worked, I have an article out in the Journal of, what's it called, DIME, Diasporic, Indigenous, and Minority Language Education, on the work that I did in Chiapas with Patricia Velasco, another colleague. And certainly what I saw was just very poor transitional bilingual education. And you know, I say that it's about subtractive bilingualism, but it's subtractive bilingualism that we talked yesterday about the bicycle, the motorcycle, remember? And I want to show you that this is a flat tire. This isn't even a motorcycle, because what you have, of course, is that fails completely, right? So I think that that's important. Just some images, right? This is, as you know, the book that the SEP puts out, the Secretaría de Educación Pública of Mexico puts out in Tzotzil, this is the same book that is taught, that is used in first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, right? With the same stories, etc. Children take enormous pride in it, as they do in all their books that are often wet from the humidity and all that. But certainly, they don't have much more, right? These are children who are still being taught in classrooms in which there's rain coming in, where there's a dirt floor. Lots of paper, as you see, but very disorganized in a kind of way, right? So what we can say about Tzeltal and Tzotzil is that there is really very strong languages in these indigenous communities, which are usually just 23 families with 100 kids. And these are the languages of those communities, but very weak power despite the political struggle, and very weak language education policy that everybody has forgotten about now that the struggle, the political armed struggle is over. So there has been this transitional bilingual education, but I think it's completely insufficient. And also, and I think this is important for us to think about also, this language maintenance, which again, I'm sort of thinking about it, I'm putting it in quotation marks because I know it's a big topic in our discourse. It's certainly a big topic in sociology of language, language maintenance and language shift. But I think, again, as we think about the future where we're really recognizing linguistic diversity in a much more inclusive way, we should think whether language maintenance is what we want, or more of language sustainability for a future, right? So that more flexibility in language use. Sometimes, I think, who was this? You were describing, Deborah, that's Deborah, Catherine, sorry. Paraguay struggle with Guarani the other day. I know that Berlin has described it, the struggles in Bolivia with Quechua, probably many of you have done so. But the idea, of course, that there are these struggles between the orthodox linguists who want the language to be as it was many, many, many years ago, and the community that, of course, now uses it more flexibly because it's been in contact with Spanish for years and years and years, so that the variety of the language that is used is, it's a different kind of variety. So I think there is a struggle that we need to sort of give up, because I think that it is, you know, when I was young, I had the privilege of working with Einar Haugen, who was the person who started the studies of bilingualism in the United States. Einar Haugen was Norwegian, as you know, and he worked in the Midwest. And Einar always used to say, it is better to bend than to break. And that is, I think, a message that I took from him many years ago, and I really believe in it. So I think we need some flexibility here. And I think the concept of language maintenance sometimes is too structured, too strict, too rigid for what we want people to do with language. So besides the language maintenance of Central and Tzotzil for very limited domains, in very poor conditions, without any power, and I don't know if that's what we want for Central and Tzotzil, there is really partial majority language acquisition as most of the children leave after the 5th grade. Some of them come to the U.S. Many of the people in the communities in which I visited had children in Tampa, of all places, or get pregnant, usually, for the girls. So there is this sense that all the language education policy that we put in place, if we don't put in place also some economic conditions for them to be carried out well, do not result in much. So I'm going to take you to another indigenous context, but this time around the world in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But so I want to talk then of some of the sociolinguistics of Maori, and the idea, and of course this is an Eastern Polynesian language. The Maoris arrived in what we know today as New Zealand, which they call Aotearoa, in the 13th century from somewhere in Eastern Polynesia, from some of the islands. The Europeans arrived centuries later in the 17th century, but it became a British colony in 1840. But in that same year, when they became a British colony, there was a treaty established, the Treaty of Waitangi, which of course protected Maori, their lands, their homes, and all their treasures. Of course, just like the San Andres Accords, no one really did anything with this treaty, except it was there. I'll come back to that in a second. Just again, some information about Maori. It was spoken by most Maoris until World War II, and then there was a rapid language shift, basically until the 1980s, and by 1973, fewer than 18% of the population, Maori population spoke it. But since the 1980s, language revitalization, one after the other, and today 35% of the population speaks it, and it's growing. And we'll talk about what made that possible. So what made that possible, of course, was this Waitangi Tribunal. I told you about the treaty, but in 1986, this is all taken to court, and the tribunal rules in favor of the Maori, saying that they had been guaranteed their taonga, their treasures, among which was their language, and that the British had really not lived up to the treaty. And it also guaranteed a distinctive identity as Maori, and also self-determination for themselves, and I think that's very, very important. And then the following year, Maori was recognized as an official language of New Zealand, Aotearoa, and also this Commission of Maori Language was then created. So how did they do it in terms of language and education policy? And I'm using LIEP because LEP stands for something else. So how did they do it? They did it, I think, by thinking, and this is, again, I think as Leslie said yesterday, and many of you have repeated, it's not the school itself that can make the change, but the schooling connected with the social and political power that had been then given to the Maoris by the tribunal. Of course, that restituted their lands and also paid them for their land. So all of a sudden, the Maoris had money to establish their own educational system. But they had a problem, and the problem, of course, was that most of the population was no longer speaking Maori. So the issue was, how do you bring it back? And of course, what they did was they established these kohanga reo, this is just one of them, which have become very well known around the world, especially with indigenous communities. They're known as the language nests movement, and I think there are a lot of people here in the US and New Mexico and in Latin America who work with language nests, Louis Meyer being one of them. And these kohanga reo schools were really not schools, they were centers for little children to be together with the grandparents. And the idea was the grandparents spoke Maori, the children, their children no longer spoke it, but the grandparents then had the taonga, the treasure, that they could pass on to their children, to their grandchildren. And this is how it started, and this has moved and moved and moved, and every day there are more children involved in this Kahangareo. And as you see today, they're more or less pre-K, daycares, not only with elders, but also with younger people who now speak it, but it's become more institutionalized. And of course, once they had a generation or enough kids to be able to have schools, then they moved up. Then they had Parekura Maori, right? Elementary schools in Maori. I want to say that two things I think have coincided in New Zealand to make the Maori education movement successful. One is, of course, that they have now some political power, but I think the other thing, and money, which is important, but the other thing is that New Zealand, as all of you who work in literacy know, has one of the best literacy practices in the world. So when you go into a school, when you go into a classroom, it is full of good literacy practices. And they have been able to translate all the English-only literacy practices to very good Maori literacy practices. So that I think that's why they have been successful. Because as you see, the classrooms are rich in material. Many school libraries, many family libraries where children also take home schools in Maori because sometimes their parents are no longer speakers of Maori, so that they want the parents also to read in Maori. So a lot of effort. Yeah, and a lot of pride about who they are. This, for example, this is the entrance to one of the schools, and it's a sculpture that shows the canoe, which is the horizontal part of the sculpture, and that is actually struggling, that a canoe is in wood, struggling against the metal parts, which are, it's a British civilization. So a lot of pride and a lot of struggle and a lot of social commitment wherever. Just the school again, just lots of happy children with lots of material, but a very strong Maori presence throughout. Remember, these are schools that are self-regulated. That is, they're run by Maoris for Maori children. So the school itself, even in architecture, shows their traditions. So what do we have in Maori schools? We have Maori taught as a language of Maoris for a bilingual future. And I want to emphasize that difference between teaching a heritage language as something that you had in your past towards teaching a language for a bilingual future that a society is going to move along, right? But I always talk about this as being part of dynamic bilingualism and what I call recursive dynamic bilingualism. And let me tell you what how I see this, because the Maoris did not start with zero. It's not when we think of additive bilingualism, we always think, oh, well, a child starts with one language, or when and you add a second one from zero. These people did not start with zero. They still have their traditions, which were always done in Maori. So there was a sense, there were some individuals in the community that had Maori. They all had bits and pieces of Maori, even if they were English monolinguals. So what they were able to do was sort of, that's what I call it recursive, reach back to these bits and pieces of the language that they had to bring them forward. So it was a constant motion of bringing forward what they had, these bits and pieces that they had to bring forward. So it's a more recursive dynamic bilingualism. Okay, and that's just images of the school. And again, So what do we have with Maori? We have this recovering strong languaging that is going on in these communities, very strong power because they're able to self-regulate, and a very strong language education policy. And as a result, what you have is our immersion, revitalization, bilingual education programs. That is, programs in which the children are immersed in Maori, but different from the Canadian immersion programs, right? We always get confused because we think this is like the Canadian immersion. Remember that the Canadian immersions were something very different, and these are for revitalization, and there's a whole sense of movement towards the future and a sense of also identity. It was for their own, it was to grow their own, right? Okay, and now I'm going to move back to Europe and to Luxembourg. And as you all know, Luxembourg is a landlocked country that's very, very rich, very, very small, with a lot of resources, and we should all have their problems. Surrounded by Germany, by France, and Belgium, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. I'll first talk a little bit, about the sociolinguistics of Luxembourgish. Now, Luxembourgish is a Germanic language. It's really part of the dialect continuum that is called the West Muscle-Franconian continuum, right? But it has been declared the national language of Luxembourg in 1984. It was a language of the heart, and therefore this was the national language. And there was then a very strong sense of trying to, again, separate it from Standard German, right? Standard German and Luxembourgish is, of course, mutually intelligible, right? But there has been corpus planning to make sure that the languages become more separated in order for this to become a national language, right? Again, process of Ausbau, what Hans Kloss calls Ausbau. So, again, for those of us that don't know too much about Luxembourg, it's important to understand that this duchy was started in 1839, and that the elite even then spoke French, Standard German, and this local Germanic variety, which was Luxembourgish, right? Before it was just a variety of German. And that most of the people, other than the elite, really spoke just a local Germanic variety, right? But what happened was that the Germans took them over in 1914. They occupied Luxembourg, and they also incorporated them during Nazi Germany. As a result of this, there was a tremendous reaction against German, and the idea then that their language was not German, but their language was different, and again, corpus planning to bring it separate from Standard German. So today, Luxembourgish is spoken by 90% of the residents of Luxembourgish. People in Luxembourg are more or less like you are, some of them, or you used to be. They cross the border daily, and it is preferred by 57% of the residents. It's considered the language of the heart. Something that's very important for us to remember is that Luxembourgish is not written, it's just spoken, and yet it's a language that is strong, maintained, sustained, whatever you call it, because it is the language of the heart, and it is the national language, and because it's important for social mobility. You can't move up in Luxembourg unless you also are a speaker of Luxembourgish. Not everything in Luxembourg is perfect. You know, I'm being today, you know, as always, when you present one side and not the other. I'm presenting the good side. We can talk a lot more about how complex it is. But certainly there has been this protection of Luxembourgish as the national language. But at the same time, because this is a country that depends on the influx of people from France, from Belgium, from Germany, also the idea that there has to be plurilingual development, including French, but also English, which is needed, and Portuguese, because most of their immigrants come from Portugal, So this is another added issue. And of course, as all of you know, the European Union is really promoting this plurilingualism. The idea, again, that what we need to do is be comfortable with many languages and use them as needed. Although, again, the idea is that you do not have to be a native speaker or even speak it well. You just have to be able to communicate, use it for particular situations. So in 1984, like I may have said before, there was this law that makes Luxembourgish a national language, but at the same time, it says that French, German, and Luxembourgish are the languages of administration and justice, and that French is a language of legislation because they didn't want German to be the language of legislation. So you know, it's just so interesting how nation states just create all these laws according to their wishes and wills, and it doesn't make any sense, but it makes sense for them. And there has been an orthographic reform and an attempt to try to write Luxembourgish a little bit more. I'll speak about what happens in schools later, but let me just, for those of you who are not familiar with Luxembourg, just tell you about the sociopolitics, very different from what we saw in Chiapas. The global power of Luxembourg is great. It has the world's second highest GDP, according to MIF, and if you want to see where we are 8th, and the other cases that we have just explored are way, way behind. It has the second largest investment fund center, and it has a very important role in the European Union as a seat of the European Court of Justice, the European Investment Bank, etc. So it's got a lot of global power. And it also has a lot of local power. 97% of the population in Luxembourg is multilingual, with 23% of them speaking 5 languages. 1 in 4 speak at least 5 languages. There is a lot of value and prestige attached to French, merely because it was a language of the elite, and it is not German. There has been an increase of French speakers in the last decade, because there are a lot more French speakers crossing the border to work in Luxembourg, but they go back to France because life in France is cheaper. Lots of transborder commuters and immigrants, making up 44% of the working force, so almost half of the people in Luxembourg are transfronterizos, as Alberto is calling them. And important Portuguese immigrants, 16% of them, that make up 16% of the foreigners. Portuguese is a big language in Luxembourg. So what do they do in schools in order to promote this, this policy of really making sure and ensuring that Luxembourgish really becomes the language of the heart, and at the same time that everybody becomes plurilingual? So one thing that they do is they have preschools that start very early. They're a rich country. The preschools are very, very well resourced, with very few kids. And they start at the age of 3. And during this time in preschool, everything is in Luxembourgish, right? The teacher speaks in Luxembourgish. The children speak in Luxembourgish. There are, as I said, many Portuguese immigrants now. The Portuguese have less Luxembourgish than the other children do, but more and more, because it's so common in society, they come in with at least receptive ability in Luxembourgish. And because they're 3 years old, and what they do is they sing and they dance and they tell stories and all of that. Luxembourgish has a real chance to be developed by the time they're 6, which is when they start elementary school. But at the same time, there are a lot of kids now from former Yugoslavia. But at the same time, because the teachers, and again, I'm not saying this is perfect, but because the teachers have this very natural attitude towards multilingualism, it's not like, oh my God, this kid speaks another language. What the teachers do in the preschools is that they incorporate children's languages. I did not see one preschool teacher that did not know how to say good morning in Portuguese, in Bosnian, you name it. They in Albanian, whatever group they had, they knew how to say good morning. The kids knew how to say good morning. They sang songs in those languages, so that there was a recognition that these children spoke other languages, even though the language of the class, of the group, was always Luxembourgish. So, remember now that they have 2 other languages to contend with. So what do? In primary education, when they start writing and reading, they do all in German initially. Even in preschool, when the teachers start reading books, she starts telling them the stories first in Luxembourgish, but then once she tells the story in Luxembourgish, she reads it in standard German. Remember, these are languages that are mutually intelligible. For those of us who speak Spanish, it would be the same as knowing the story in Spanish and hearing it in Portuguese, and if you hear it in Portuguese enough times, you really understand it. And it's the same process that takes place with the children. So even in preschool, when the teacher reads text, the teacher reads the text in standard German. But when they start writing in standard German, because again, remember, Luxembourgish is not written. French is introduced from the second half of grade 2, when the children are 8 years old. And at that point, the children are already German speaking. They speak standard German, besides Luxembourgish. And of course, they're not completely literate in standard German. They're not completely literate in any language in grade 2, but French is then introduced orally. But Luxembourgish continues to be used orally in the classroom setting. So that all the informal interactions are in Luxembourgish, even though there are times set for German instruction and for French instruction. Let me also say something about the language used in the class, because as the children picked up French also, that is starting, I would say, especially in the 4th grade, the children often are given assignments and projects which they, even if they are given during the German period, they are actually allowed and encouraged to also use French to get sources, so that the kids are constantly working in the 2 languages, and also in Portuguese. Portuguese does not have an official status in the school, but somehow the teachers are very conscious of the fact that the children are usually going to Portuguese after-school programs, Portuguese weekend programs. And again, I think it's because the teachers have this natural attitude about the fact that multilingualism is good, and after all, Portuguese is one of the European languages that the children should also be using. So it's a much freer atmosphere. At the secondary level is where I think things get rough and maybe ugly, because what there is, of course, is, as Leslie described before, Tanzania, there is there's a restriction of secondary education. There is a classical secondary school and a technical school. And the classical one, the medium of instruction is both German and French. And there is a period in Luxembourgish. And at that point, they start, remember I told you there has been an orthographic reform? And at that point, they start getting them also writing creatively in Luxembourgish, so that they can write poems and read that kind of literature that is starting to emerge. But what they are doing is they first start with German, especially 7th through 9th grade, and then turn to French 10th to 13th grade. Because, again, the prestige of the languages is French is considered more prestigious than German. First of all, because the elite in Luxembourg at one point spoke French, besides German, they were bilingual. And secondly, because of the negative associations with German and the Nazi regime.
So, is that for all students? All students will do it, or these are like choices?
No, there's an exam, and then you go to the classical one or the technical one, okay? Now, what is interesting, and again, this is the issue of language education policy and educational policy that doesn't keep up with the times, is that in the technical high school, most subjects are in German. And the reason for that is that it had always been assumed that German would be easier for the students because it was closer to Luxembourgish. But now, because most of the kids in the technical high school are Portuguese speaking, okay? That's always happens, right? So that's what I told you. This is not a pretty picture. It's wonderful in preschool. It's wonderful in elementary school. And then when you get here, you say, oh, all right, it's not so pretty, right? But so, of course, the technical high school is in German because that was thought to be easier. Turns out that for the Portuguese students, French as a Romance language is easier than German. So they're having all kinds of issues and struggles about what to do with the technical high school. So just to finish this part, so just to finish this part, maybe you need to take a break before I go to the US. But maybe I'll wrap it up first. It's just to wrap it up, then what we have is Luxembourgish used in preschool and elementary school and in the lycée technique especially, and less in the lycée classique. Literacy is introduced in German because the assumption is that it is easier than French, and French comes in later and especially is used in the lycée classique because it is considered to be more difficult, more prestigious. So what you have in these schools is a way of using these three languages to make meaning, and a more dynamic use, especially again in the elementary schools. What we see very strong languaging of a community, very strong power, and a very strong language education policy that we can call a plurilingual education. That basically sustains the use of Luxembourgish, doesn't restrict it ever. There's a lot of oral discourse that takes place in Luxembourgish throughout the education system. It is the national language, it is the language of the heart, but also a conscious effort to expand their ability to be plurilingual, to also use both. So let me just wrap up, and then we'll take a little break maybe before we do the US. So just sort of to remind you, because I know we've gone through many cases and we forget. So what you have is Gallo with very weak everything, and eventually, I think, probably language shift and monolingualism to French. Sotil and Celtal, very strong language in the community, but very weak language education policy, with a transitional bilingual education policy that does not work, and that I think we can say that it is a failed policy. With the Maori, however, being very strong, both in languaging and power, having programs that we may want to call immersion revitalization, bilingual education programs, and certainly an issue of recursive bilingualism where they are bringing back into the future a language that was used in the past. And then Luxembourgish, of course, being very strong, this multiple plurilingual education, and then this idea that what they're creating is this ability to be dynamically plurilingual in Luxembourg, again, with the issues that we have identified. So I think we want to take a little break here, maybe, I don't know, I'll tell you, but I'll take questions or whatever. But I think what we want to say is that in terms of what we can learn about these policies, what we can learn is that despite all of our postmodern thinking that treats languages as constructed and fluid, we really have to recognize our differences, and we have to really recognize that the dominant communities use schooling all the time to really devise these strategies of privilege and control. And so the question for all of us is, what can we do as educators, given the fact that this does go on in schools.
So, sort of following the same outline that we did for the other languages and the other situations. So we want to remember that Spanish, of course, is a Romance language, but that it has a very long history of, here in the United States, Heinz Voss, who I've been talking about today, it seems, said that says that it's a language of the early settlers, and certainly it's a language of the first permanent European settlers, and we have to remember that, but also of the dispossessed, a product of both purchasing and also conquest, and you know very firsthand about this, so I'm going to talk about it. And the Spanish-American War, which many of you do not know about, but since it's important for the Caribbean, I just thought I would remind you of all of it. So, but then it's also the language of laborers, of immigrants, and of the Spanish-speaking diaspora. So, to remember, it's not just an immigrant language, but it's a language that has been around for a very long time. We keep talking about it as if it's just a language of the newcomers. It's a language that has been here, that has some history. And I think, as Elena was telling us before, I think I don't have to remind you that it is spoken at home by 14% of the U.S. population. What percentage is here in El Paso? 80%, right. Okay, I'm sure you contribute greatly to that number. You should be very proud of it, but it's still amazing that for the entire country it is as high as it is. And as far as Latinos are concerned, we make up 18% of the population. You see a little bit of a language shift there, but we really should talk about what that means also. It is the 5th largest Spanish-speaking country, and we need to remember that.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, the only largest Spanish-speaking countries are Mexico, Colombia, Spain, and Argentina. And I don't know about Spain. It depends on whether you're counting the Catalans and the Basques and what will happen next. But we also have to acknowledge that as far as Spanish is concerned, right, 63% of Spanish speakers come from Mexico. And those are followed by Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Salvadorans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, and Colombians in that order. So of course, your Mexican Spanish contributing greatly to Spanish in the U.S. But we also have to remind ourselves that the presence of Spanish in the U.S. right now has been, and the recognition, whatever recognition we now have, has been a result of political struggle, the civil rights era, Cesar Chavez, and women's movements and all kinds of things. And we have to remember that especially the bilingual education field is a result of that struggle. But we also, I think, need to recognize the fact that there has been some stepping back from that political struggle in the country. Again, I don't know what's happening in El Paso, and I was hoping that we would hear a lot more about El Paso right now, but certainly a lot of stepping back nationally. And I think that the silencing, and Elena was talking about this yesterday, of what Jim Crawford calls the B word is obvious, and that is one of the reasons why I talk about emergent bilinguals, because I think if we don't name our reality, no one will name our reality, so we need to continue to name it in order for people to understand it. But it's certainly a fact that all the offices and all the laws that had bilingual, the word bilingual in them, when I started in this field, have now been, the word bilingual has been substituted by English language acquisition, and I think it's important for us to understand this retreat, and for young people feel and left, to remember that.
What does this mean, right?
What? Oh no, 4. Oh, okay, all right. But anyway, sometimes we forget the history of all of this.
again, following the same kind of format that I use for the other languages, the sociopolitics of Spanish, its role as a threatening minority language, and I think even though, as we all know, U.S. English as the federal constitution amendment failed and has been given up at the state level, 21 states have declared English as an official language. Is it an official language here in Texas? No,
Arizona.
Arizona. No, but every other state, 21 states. If you think about the history of okay, if you think about the history of, the only time of American history in which there has been this restriction, legal restriction, was around World War I. 1923, when Meyer versus Nebraska was decided, there was then, I think there were 23 states that have declared English official. So we're at the same, the same historical juncture. But at the same time, and I think as Elena discussed earlier, the role of Spanish in an expanding global market. It's a market that has a lot of buying power. We have to recognize the marketing of this Latinidad in popular culture. I don't know what's happening here, but I can tell you that in New York, it's become fashionable, right? It's Ricky Martin and Shakira and J-Lo and whatever, and it's become popular again. It's not just Ricky Ricardo, but it's become mainstream. And it's TV stations, radio stations. My son works for 2 Spanish language radio stations, and he's doing very well because the Spanish language market is just growing and growing, even though we have all this other technology. And the radio audiences in both Los Angeles and Miami in Spanish are larger than in English. In New York City, the second most popular radio program is in Spanish and not in English, so it's big, big, big. And as far as print publications, I don't have to tell you, lots of newspapers in Spanish, so strong that way. What's happening in schools? And again, I'm giving you a national picture, which I hope you can fill in with your local picture here. For non-Latinos, it's usually taught as a subject, but usually as a subject only in intermediate and high schools and colleges, of course. It is the most popular language studied in high schools and colleges. It's studied by 69% of high school students and 53% of the college students. But it is still considered a foreign language, right? And even though, for example, in New York State, we have now adopted languages other than English, people keep going back to foreign, and you have to keep reminding them. So there is this issue with the field and where Spanish falls. And then the other option for non-Latinos to learn Spanish is bilingual education at either the elementary or the intermediate level. And notice I didn't put down high schools because I think that there are very, very few high schools in which the language is used as a medium of instruction. I can name one in New York City, and it's a name only because I can tell you in reality it's not bilingual, but he claims it is because he's getting some kinds of funding for a dual language program, a dual language grant. So I think that they're rare. But still, there are some programs of immersion in Spanish and two-way immersion of bilingual education, what you know as two-way dual language program. But always with the notion that this is a language of the other, right? It's not the language, it's a language of the other. For Latinos, we have mostly transitional bilingual education programs. If you are a newcomer, if you are fortunate enough to be a newcomer, then you have some possibility of being educated in Spanish, but as we all know, that leads to subtractive bilingualism, language shift. There's been a movement to have, as I think we rightly need to have, programs as a subject in secondary schools and in colleges where Spanish is taught not as a foreign language, but as Spanish for Spanish speakers, as what is also known as Spanish for native speakers, and more recently Spanish for heritage language speakers. I just want to caution you again about the use of heritage. I followed this discourse shift very closely. It almost parallels our giving up the word bilingual because, as you know, heritage was a word that was used in Canada from the very beginning. It was never used in the U.S. until about 2002 when there was a conference in Los Angeles or San Francisco, I forget. I have an article on that in the Modern Language Journal. So this questioning of the word heritage and what it means and why it is and how it has paralleled our giving up the term bilingual and what it means. And the other objection that I often have with it, not that I think is bad, but I think that some of the heritage language programs work against bilingualism and work against the acquisition and the development of Spanish by Latinos because they're constantly telling them that they're not doing it correctly, they're not speaking Spanish correctly, or that the Spanish that they speak is not real Spanish, right? And so you have to be very careful, and I think that people who teach Spanish as a heritage language really have to have very good training, which I think in most cases they don't have. And so they tend to be very prescriptive with Spanish rather than really allow the students to appropriate their Spanish with their contact with English, which has to occur where in a bilingual context. And we're using Spanish often only in a bilingual context, never in a monolingual context. The other two options for Latino are two-way immersion bilingual education language programs, what are called dual language in many places, and then one-way developmental bilingual education programs, again, often called just dual language. For, I don't know about you, but in our case, there are a few elementary schools that have what we may be able to call one-way developmental bilingual education. It's been also interesting for me how we have given up the term bilingual. At least in New York City, we only use bilingual sometimes to refer to transitional programs, and then we use dual language for everything else. Doing two things, creating tremendous amount of confusion. I always tell the story of I was in a principal's office one day when a mother came in to register the child. So they have options, right? And so the principal said to her, usted puede poner a la niña o en el programa bilingüe o en el programa dual. Pero mire, ponga a la niña en el programa dual, porque si lo pone en el programa dual, va a ser bilingüe. Pero si lo pone en el bilingüe, no va a ser bilingüe. And as often happens in school, something happened, so the principal had to run out of the office. And the woman looked at me as if the principal had three heads. And she said to me, ¿Cómo es posible? El dual es bilingüe, el bilingüe no es bilingüe. Tremendous confusion, right? And I also think, again, we have been complicit in this, in having given this up, right? So I think we have to really be careful. And that's why when I use it, which I use it because you have to use it in order for people to understand, and because I don't want to be seen as just being critical of it, because I think they're good spaces, you could work more within them, but I think they're good spaces. But I always just refer to them as dual language bilingual. People say that's a tautology. I said, that's all right. I'll repeat it so people get it. So I think like yesterday, I just want you to think about this use of dual and to think about what it means. Is it additive? Are we thinking about it from a monoglossic perspective? One of the concerns that I always have is that then when you're thinking about it separately, that second language speaker is always a second language speaker. It's always a second language, and I don't know when you stop being a second language speaker. Am I a second language speaker? I don't know. You know, it's like, and so it doesn't make any sense to me. That whole literature doesn't make any sense to me from a personal perspective. So I don't think it can make sense to a lot of people. But since it's been written from another perspective, then people don't see it. But I do think that by telling people, students all the time, English is your second language, what you're doing is you're not letting them appropriate English. which they have to do. They're going to grow up here. These are the ones in New York City. They're people who will come and they're going to grow up in New York City. And therefore, you want them to appropriate English. You don't want them to think that English is their second language, which is what you always say. Spanish is your first, or you speak Spanish at home and you speak English in school. No, that's no longer a reality. The reality is that even the day that you arrive, you also already have English in your home. The television is on, the radio is on, you have it, it's there, right? So this issue of L1 and L2, and then you can't be really bilingual because that doesn't exist as an American possibility. And I think that's the question and what we have to think about. So I think we talked about this yesterday, and I think since most of you were here, I'll skip it. But I think what we are very concerned with Common Core state standards, which I know you don't have to be, so that's wonderful. You don't think it's wonderful? All right. We can discuss that. We're going crazy. We're going crazy. But so, but it's you know, I think that I use this because I think it makes clear to people what I mean by this. Because if you look at the Common Core state standards from a dual reality, what it means is that there are English language standards and then Spanish language standards, but there are no bilingual standards where when the children can really demonstrate what they can do using their entire linguistic repertoire and not just half. So let me give you an example. This is a 6th grade for beginning students new to English. This is an example, right? And so one of the things they ask them to do is able to identify key individuals, events, and ideas as they're introduced in a text. And then it says, these are the things that they ask the teachers to do, right? And my question always is, well, if the standard is about identifying individuals, events, and ideas in a text, why is it that they have to identify them in English? What if they know what the individuals are? All of us know that receptive abilities are developed before productive abilities. So chances are that children would understand a written text in English before they can actually answer something in English. But they can certainly show that they understand it in Spanish, right? So the whole idea is that if you are requiring them, if you're saying that they don't have the standard because they can't show it in English, that doesn't meet the standard, because the standard is about something else. The standard is about identifying these things in a text, which you could do through other means. And the other thing that always upsets me is that teachers always say, well, they can point, they can use gestures, they can draw. They can't use a language they know. It doesn't make sense. So I think that's the idea. So anyway, so that's my translanguaging idea. And just because I didn't cover it yesterday, just want to make sure that we all know that this was a term introduced in Welsh by Ken Williams and Baker, Colin Baker translated it. I taught it in North Wales last year. I've gotten all the story about how the term came about in a bar and how it happened and all that. But anyway, but it originally, and in the way that it's still used in Wales, it's originally the input is in one language and the output is in another, and they shift and they change so that students get the sense of being able to use those languages that way. And since then, it's been really extended to just flexible bilingual use by many people. So these are just some. And I think we went through this yesterday. So I think what we have to question then is whether this dual separation that, and by the way, again, I want to say, I'm a student of Fishman. I'll always be a student of Fishman. I'll die being a student of Fishman. But you know, I think as all students, we have to go beyond our professors. And the main macro sociolinguistic concept was, of course, that of diglossia, right? That of you have one language that you use in some ways, usually a high language, and then you have this other low language that you use in other domains which have less power. But my objection to diglossia is that it describes a reality that is artificially constructed through power. There is no reason why this I language has to be used in powerful situations and this other language has to be used in these other more, what do you call it, less powerful situations. It's only, so you can use the concept to describe, but that's not enough for me. I think you have to also question why those inequalities exist, and I think we have to sort of get away from this notion and sort of think of it a more transglossic approach to the duality. So I think one of the things that we can start thinking about is whether this dual separation that we often insist on is just a new strategy of privileging monolingualism and controlling of bilingualism, which makes us really unable to create this trans subject, which I equal participant, which I think would be important, so that we don't have to choose. We don't have to do what you are asking us to do one or the other. I mean, English is as much my language as Spanish is. It's not less, it's not more. It's just as much as. What it does is it makes us unable to change the content of the conversation and the perspectives and the terms with which we have the conversation. We continue to talk about first language and second language when, as we know, those of us who are bilingual often cannot differentiate what is their first and what is their second. I can differentiate maybe which one I learned first. I know I learned Spanish first. But which is my first and which is my second? I don't know. Depends, right? Depends on the circumstances, who I'm speaking to, what I'm doing with the language, right? Those are terms that mean nothing to a bilingual. If you're looking at it from a bilingual perspective, not from a monolingual perspective. Native language is another term I think that is highly contested. And I always give Bonfiglio's example because I think this is a good example. And Bonfiglio starts his book with giving the example of an ad that is run by a school in Hong Kong that needs native English teachers, right? So the ad runs, and you know what happens the next day. What happens the next day? Who shows up for the position? Who shows up for the position? Chinese ethnics who consider themselves native speakers, right? So the following day, the ad comes out and says, Caucasian native English speakers needed, right? So I think what we have to really realize is that this concept of native language is not only, it's an ideal category, but it's also a category that is very exclusive. It sort of creates a circle. Who is a native speaker and who is not? I'm a native speaker, I don't know. So it's that question, and I think, again, we have to work against this notion. I think we have to work against the notion of it being a heritage language. I haven't found a good word for it, so maybe you can help me think about that. Because it's, what my objection to the heritage is that it sort of brings you to the past. And, you know, we want a language for the future here in the United States, a bilingualism for the United States, not just what we're doing. Otherwise, I think our kids will continue to fail. So definitely it privileges English monolingualism. And then I think the other issue that I think we all have to take responsibility for is that it has been an adaptive response of ourselves as Latinos as a result of this anti-bilingual backlash that really makes us participate in our own powerlessness. And I think that we also have to take some responsibility for. So these are all mechanisms of control that we have been discussing. I know that it was a long time ago when I spoke about these other situations, but certainly what we have in the US with Spanish is not only a silencing of it, but also a series of double entendres, so that we continue to talk about things in ways that, in some ways, always privileges monolingualism and makes us very confused. So to answer the first question that I started with, and one of the lessons, so one of the lessons is that all language practices in the schools are not neutral, but they're conditioned by power. that all state schools erase, use insufficiently, use late, protect, or silence, and confuse non-dominant language practices to give advantage to dominant groups. Yes, even in Luxembourg, we've seen it. That monoglossic language ideologies and practices means that children with different language practices are never given an opportunity to show what they can do, what they can really do, and that advantages monolinguals. And that non-dominant groups anxious to use their language practices in schools sometimes resist, but sometimes adapt to dominant practices, participating in their own powerlessness and in dominant double entendres. So I end with the same slide I ended yesterday, which I always end with, again, because it's the words of a child that really made me understand that, and I think we all know that without the heart and the veins working together, children cannot grow. Así que gracias.